So many people may have seen the memes being posted about the Area 51 raid. Well, I thought it was all just memes and was all jokes. And since I run a meme page for fun, I posted some of those memes. I then got a direct message from an account with 0 followers and following 0 people, saying I'm from the future. People go through with the raid and release creatures, information, and new weapons into the world. I didn't bother answering because he was probably some guy just trying to be funny. Then I got a phone call right after I had seen the message from an unknown caller. A deep voice that was 100% a voice modifier started talking and said, "I'm not kidding. I'm a time traveler, and I'm trying to warn everyone about this raid. Just listen to me." I was freaked out at this point because I had no clue how he got my number, but I was confused on if it was even the same guy. People just don't go marching into Area 51. They bring all sorts of weapons, guns, knives, baseball bats, you name it. They start attacking everyone at Area 51 and come out successful. They storm into the building and keep attacking everyone who stands in their way. I tried to say something, but he stopped me. "Don't talk. There's not enough time. Just listen." They start going through the entire base finding information like the government is rigged, countries that have unknown resources underground that could be used for different things like weapons, buildings, or making humans evolve into a stronger species. He told me that information is released about planets that have life on them. He told me about weapons that shoot lasers like video games, and how people started to use them against guards. He said that there was different testing rooms where plants, animals, and even humans were being tested on. Then they made it to where they kept any creatures that aren't supposed to be on Earth. He kept saying the creatures they found and released were locked up and hidden for a reason. He said that all the creatures were on a certain level of danger. Level 1 was the lowest, and level 3 was the highest. They started with the level 1 creatures, which were creatures like animals with 2 heads or humans that were mutated and had wings or tails. Then they made it to the level 2 creatures, which were creatures that looked like something from another planet. Scaly skin, claws, wings, massive teeth. Some were still animals, but were bigger than they should be, and had sharp teeth. When they finally made it to the level 3 creatures, they found creatures that were almost like bats, but they were bigger and had no fur. These bats-like creatures had bones and ripped up military uniforms in their cell. Another creature was a skinny white creature with black eyes, and when one of the people raiding looked through the glass to see it and was staring at it, he started chanting satanic stuff and shot himself. At the end of all the creatures was a room with cameras and buttons to lock and unlock the doors. There was one button that would unlock or lock them all at once instead of one by one. One of the people raiding decided to press that button when no one else would, and he released all the creatures. He said doors started opening, and all the creatures went wild and started to run and fly around the Area 51 base. Some were attacking each other. The people raiding all ran through an emergency exit and found their way out of the base, where they were surrounded by more military waiting for them. They were gunned down, and when they tried to tell the military what happened, one of the walls was bursted through, and all the creatures escaped and ran different ways. The military tried to shoot them, but some creatures attacked. When they all attacked, the military's weapons weren't enough, and they were all wiped out by the level 3 creatures, and the raiders were killed in the mess too. Days after the raid, cities began getting attacked by different creatures, and were all destroyed. The world becomes a playground for these creatures. I'm warning you now, so let others know that people go through with the raid. He hung up the phone, and when I tried to call him back so I could ask questions, the number wasn't even a working number. My grandfather was many things, but a good man was not one of them. In the spring of '96, shortly before his 66th birthday, I witnessed him being hauled off to the big house for the kidnapping and murder of 4 young boys. I was barely 9 at the time, Being so young, I hardly understood what was happening. All I knew was that my whole world was being shattered. As I grew up, I learned of the depraved acts of violence he committed, either through the television or internet. It was not to say that I was completely convinced. After all, this man had practically raised me. True, I knew what it was like to experience the sharp whip of a belt, but he never mistreated me. In fact, most of my memories growing up were enjoyable when I thought about him. So how could this man, who I loved and respected, possibly have committed such vile acts? It was a question that plagued me for years, especially after the trial was over and he was given the death penalty. I often wanted to find an excuse to visit him in the county lockup while he lived out his last days in a padded isolation cell, to have him tell me in his own words why he did these things. But I never found the courage. Last month, we got a notification from the state that they finally gave the go-ahead to carry out his sentencing, death by lethal injection. It was this incident that actually spurred me to go down and have a final word with the old man. I figured it would need to be now or never. My brothers and sisters all felt it was a waste of time, but I wanted to be absolutely sure the person we grew up with was, in fact, the devil. It was raining when I arrived outside of the correctional center. Claps of thunder shook the heavens, and eerie fog hung low over the air. A fitting pall cast over the dreary thoughts that plagued me. As was standard procedure, I left all my belongings at the front security checkpoint. Then the guard led me down a series of maze-like corridors, toward what seemed like the bowels of the earth itself. Eventually, we arrived at one of the private wards, where the more dangerous prisoners were kept, and the officer gestured to the last cell on the left, where I saw a glimmer of a man I once knew. It was clear by the blood on his shirt and skin and the bruises on his scalp and chest that he had not been receiving proper care. I was expecting to meet a monster, something so hideous in demeanor and stature, that I could at last come to peace with all the sins I've been told. Yet instead, I found myself looking at a trembling, frail elder, barely able to stand up, let alone raise a threat to anyone here. "Are you staying for his final meal?" the guard asked. I felt such a whirlwind of emotions, trying desperately to reconcile all the feelings I had for this man. It took every bit of strength for me to nod my head toward the officer. Once alone with my grandfather shackled to a table and given nothing except a plastic spoon to eat, it was time for answers. I began to launch a series of questions to him, anything to verify the accusations made against him. Of course, I knew when he was arrested, the police had indisputable evidence, but I wanted to hear it from his lips. Instead of answering me, though, my grandfather slowly ate his meal, seemingly accepting his fate. I was beginning to think I came here for nothing. Finally, I let out a long sigh, pushing aside the food and forcing him to look me in the eye. "Don't you realize that you are about to die? Don't you want the world to know why you committed such evil?" I shouted to him. I saw a mixture of emotions in that man's eyes that I will never forget. And then he did something that surprised me, and began to use his untrimmed fingernails to scrawl a message onto the table in front of me. He did it slowly and deliberately, as to not attract the attention of the guards outside his cell. And when he finished, I felt a cold lump in my throat, immediately recognizing the shortened number of a storage unit he rented on the south side of town. I quickly memorized the sequence, and then scrawled the table a bit more to prevent any of the officers from reading it before being asked to leave. Then I asked the guard how long it would be before the actual execution, and he gave me a timeline for the next morning. That gave me less than 5 crucial hours to find Grandpa's storage unit and discover whatever secrets he had hidden there. Despite the late hour, I didn't miss a beat driving down to the downtown district. The complex in question was one of several businesses along a strip that offered the same services, a perfect hiding spot for criminal activity, without even realizing it. This one in particular was a little more downtrodden than the others. There was nothing besides a rudimentary keypad to protect the units, and with the code I had been given, bypassing it only took seconds. There weren't any security cameras or even streetlights to guide my way to the correct unit, but I had been here so often with him, I probably could have found the place with my eyes closed. Back when we were just kids, Grandpa was a vending machine operator and would often store his broken down candy slots in the place, along with any other knickknacks he liked to collect. The unit itself was sealed up by the cheapest of bicycle locks, which I broke with ease. I would like to pretend this was my first time ever breaking and entering into a place, but a childhood of foster care and bouncing from one home to another tells a different story. Inside the wide trailer, I smelled damp furniture and old food. It was a musty, grimy odor that made me cover my mouth in repulsion. Then I used my smartphone and started to scour the place for any sort of clues. Mentally, I wished that I had the time to ask more detailed questions from him about what I was looking for. I checked old books he collected first, followed by old movies. I felt like it was taking forever to find anything possibly relating to the missing kids. Then a little after midnight, I came across a small shoebox labeled Sessions that gave me pause. Call it a sixth sense, but something felt off about it, so I slid it out and found precisely 5 blank VHS tapes inside, all of which looked to have about 30 minutes worth of film on them. Nothing exactly special, but again, I felt this odd tingle on the back of my spine that told me this was the right box. I left immediately, doing my best to cover my tracks and get out of there before any random bystanders decided to be nosy and see what I was up to. As I drove off, my mind was admittedly all over the place. I didn't know what could possibly be on these tapes, and I wasn't even sure I wanted to find out. The decision was made, though, at the next traffic light. A luminous neon billiard from a pawn shop only a few streets down caught my eye. So I parked and ran inside, spending about 5 minutes pretending to browse before using cash to buy a VCR. I couldn't have sped home any faster. Setting up the equipment took a little bit, but once I was ready, I actually found my hands shaking. Did I really want to do this? I said a prayer, then I popped in the first tape. The screen filled with a burst of static. Then I found myself staring at the frame of a 7-year-old boy. It was easy to see that he was sitting in a small room no larger than a broom closet, and wearing nothing besides some simple school clothes. He was doing his best not to look scared as a voiceover narration began. Subject 1, Day 5. I've done my best to remove every element from the room, but there have been no signs of starvation. I am forced to consider other options leading to expiration. I had to stop the tape. My head was already swimming. That was undoubtedly the voice of my grandfather. And there he was, talking so candidly about keeping food from a poor child. I couldn't even fathom continuing with the tape. But still, something compelled me further down this road. I fast-forwarded to see a few similar sessions. Grandpa was now attempting to sedate the poor boy with a horse tranquilizer, and I saw the child scream. I stopped watching after that. What did my grandfather hope I would learn by watching some vile acts? My hands literally shook as I popped in the second tape, noting it was already wound toward the end. I thought that would mean I wouldn't have to watch more torture. I was wrong. Subject 2, Day 33. I have had little chance but to resort to more violent means. The subject is being given a weapon that I have chosen to help with the extraction. I will be observing the process as best as possible, Grandpa said. It was a carving knife. He gave that poor child a carving knife. After being locked in a cage for over a month with little food or water, I knew full well what Grandpa expected to happen. I stopped the tape right before the boy picked up the weapon. I covered my mouth and muffled a scream as I threw some random objects across the room. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the evidence was too strong to say otherwise, despite the fact that I knew worse was likely to come. I had to discover the truth, so I picked up the one tape with a label on it. It was partially torn, but I gathered it read, "Information." The tape started with Grandpa addressing the camera. "The creature has moved from subject 2 to 3. My hopes of collecting it were futile. It seems that now I have little choice but to cause the third child. No, I mustn't grow an attachment." He was rambling, and I didn't understand what he meant about a creature. I saw tears in his eyes as he adjusted the camera. Subject 3 is a 10-year-old. I tried my hardest to keep him away from the others, but it would seem my initial theory of the bond for all four was correct. It can only mean that the answer is complete and utter annihilation of the entire group. Grandpa paused, looking at the trembling boy and muttering, "I only wish they could understand what it is I do for them." I stared at the grainy image, his words sounding hollow and meaningless for a moment, until I gathered them together to make sense. He was talking about these children as though they were possessed. Was he attempting some sort of folkish exorcism on these 4 children? I drove toward the prison once more, desperate for closure. He sent me on this path, so I knew he would have answers. The guards were already preparing to strap him down for the injection when I arrived and locked eyes with him. "I need to ask him one thing, please," I said, my voice trembling. The nurse preparing the lethal dose stopped, and I ran to my grandfather's side, trying to see under the mask of innocence the evil that he had done. "Please, Poppy, tell me. Is it true? Why? Did you really believe that what you were doing was right?" I asked, tears trailing down my cheeks. He gave me the saddest of smirks and squeezed my hand. "You saw everything, my child. Go now. Be free of this curse," he warned me. I could not stay. I could not come to terms with the madness that had driven him so far from me. The silent drive home felt like a procession, a funeral for someone that no one cared about. I did not dare to believe his secret. I gathered the courage to burn the tapes, to destroy the evil once and for all. But before I did, I told myself I needed to be 100% sure of what I believed, so I watched the final tape. My grandfather was many things, but being a good man was not one of them. I found out that he carried all our sins the day I watched that last tape. I found I was looking at the younger frame of myself. If I am successful here, I shall transfer the demon from my granddaughter to my own body. I shall then at last be able to free this world of this menace. I touched the screen with more tears. I was happy. I was sad. I was devastated. And I understood everything. And yet as the tape faded to black, and I watched my lifeless body convulse, I saw a flicker of a shadow. I understood nothing. Mr. Johnson always greeted me with a smile in the morning. He'd flaunt those pearly whites shamelessly, just barely noticeable under that crazy mustache. You know, the one where it sort of looks like a crow has died trying to consume your nose? And he'd wave energetically as I walked down to my mailbox. I'd raise my hand idly and do the old good morning neighbor routine, but I'd quickly retreat to avoid getting trapped in conversation. He was nice enough, though, but he was one of those extremely neat and extremely boring kind of people. If he caught you off guard, you'd be talking about the weather for hours. Mr. Johnson moved in next door a little over a month ago. The place had been empty for a year or so, ever since old man Gordon kicked the bucket. He didn't have many relatives, and it took them a while to figure out who'd be taking over the property. After 6 months, the deed was signed over to his nephew, who in turn tried to flip the place post haste. But because of the nature of his uncle's death, he was found rotting in his basement a month after he died. There wasn't much interest. Until Mr. Johnson came around. He didn't seem to mind the history of the place at all. In fact, he'd brag about it constantly, as if the rot stain on the concrete floor was some kind of trophy. It didn't bother me at first. I like a good cadaver story just as much as the next guy, but when you factored in the mustache and that holier-than-thou smirk, it became increasingly tiresome. And then I started noticing that he always seemed to have blood on his clothes. I don't know when it started, but I know that after I first noticed it, I couldn't not see it anymore. It was just too obvious, yet so indistinguishable. Every day, clean clothes, fresh blood stain. On his sleeve, on the leg of his pants, on the collar of his shirt, on the tip of his boots. Just a little drop, a vague smudge of red, a little hint of the old crimson. And his smile was fading. Just a tad bleaker every morning, a little broodier, a little darker, until it was gone. I'd ask him about the blood sometimes, just, out of curiosity. You can't help it when you keep seeing it daily. You need answers. It's human nature. So, I'd say, what's with the blood? It's just paint, he'd say, avoiding eye contact at all cost. I've been redoing the basement. And so it went. Every other day, I'd ask again, and he would reply with some incompetent excuse that wouldn't hold up in court. I believed him for a bit, I'll admit it. He did seem like the type that would redo things just to have something to blab on about with his golf buddies. But after the second week of painting, my skepticism was skyrocketing, and with the accelerated decline of his smile, I knew something dubious was going on. So one day I decided enough was enough, and just confronted him right there on the street. So, I said, want to show me your basement? He stared at me for quite some time, his mustache dancing like a drunk caterpillar, his eyebrows raising and lowering like pinball flippers. I could see a drop of sweat forming on his forehead, slowly making its way down to the root of his nose. His eyes darted back and forth like they were following a phantom laser pointer. Sure, he eventually responded. But, I'm not done redoing it yet. It's a bit messy. I just shrugged. I don't mind, I said. I just want to see how it's coming along. He nodded nervously and awkwardly ushered me up his driveway. I paced up to his door and turned to face him. He seemed flustered, no doubt about it. He definitely had something to hide. In we go then, he said weirdly as he opened the door. I followed him in and looked around briefly as we walked towards the stairs leading to the basement. He'd really managed to fix the place up. Everything was sparkling new and shiny. Very nice, I noted. You've been hard at work, I see. He nodded and gave me a half-hearted smile. Yes, but the basement is proving to be quite a handful. I followed him down the stairs into the basement. At first glance, everything seemed fine. Shiny hardwood floors covered the old concrete. The walls were painted in a tasteful crimson color, and he'd even replaced the old window with a stylishly profiled one. I raised my eyebrow inquisitively. This is spotless, I said. I thought you said it was messy. He hanged his head in what I assumed to be shame. Yes, but there's this thing. He pointed to the corner of the room. Behind the sofa. He walked over to the sofa and motioned for me to take a look. I followed close behind and peered over his shoulder. Ah, yes, I said knowingly. I see what you mean. It keeps coming back, he complained. I don't know what to do. It must be rust or something. I have an idea, I said, staring into the back of his neck. Forget all about it. He turned to face me, his expression quite bewildered. I jabbed my knife into his jugular with some precision and enjoyed the brief shower of blood before he sank down to the ground, a lovely pool of crimson steadily growing around him. It didn't take long before his heart gave up, and he just lay there motionless, his ridiculous mustache now slightly more tolerable, tinted red. Is that still paint on your clothes? I said mockingly. I hung his body from the ceiling with a rope I found in his garage. The last remaining pints of blood dripped into the bucket below. The soothing clanks and glops like chicken soup for the soul. I studied the stain hidden behind his sofa. It would appear I had a leak. The brown-red mush gathering in a stinking pond looking all too familiar. I suspected one of the pipes of my acid tanks needed some fixing, but it must have seeped into the foundations, eventually ending up here. Such a shame, really. It completely ruined the new hardwood floors. When night falls, I'll drag his body home and drop it into one of the tanks. It will take 2 days for the bones to dissolve. That should be enough time to fix the leak and clean up this mess. I seriously hope the next owner doesn't have a mustache. Thank you for making it this far. I hope you enjoyed the video. I just wanted to quickly let you know about a couple things I have going on. I have an Instagram where I post more personal things about who I am. It isn't just all creepy stuff. You can find me at Stories After Midnight. I also have a Twitter where I mainly retweet and like things I find interesting. The handle for that is in the description, but it is S_A_midnight. I should really find another one because that's hard to say. If you really like what I'm doing, consider joining the Midnighters. That's my growing community, where we hang out and have fun and talk about cats. You can find a link to our Discord in the description below. We'd love to see you there. Other than that, it'd make me happier than a cat on a table full of antique glassware if you'd like the video and consider sticking around for more. We'll see you in the next one.